The last words of a world are rarely spoken in triumph. They come instead in crackling bursts of desperation, carried on failing Vox relays, whispered by voices already resigned to silence. Picture a planetary governor, robes torn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, standing before the Aquila that once symbolized order and protection. His people starve in the streets, manufactoria lie cold, and the skies, those once proud skies, burn with the contrails of descending imperial warships. He knows what comes next, though he dares not speak it plainly. Exterminatus, a cleansing by fire and void, sanctioned by the very Imperium that was meant to preserve this world. His broadcast is not meant to rally his citizens, for there is no army left to rally. It is a confession, a plea, and a requiem all at once. And in the grim dark of the far future, even the act of confessing can be a crime punishable by silence, everlasting. Before we descend fully into this dying world's final hours, take a moment to strengthen the ranks of this channel. Every subscription, every shared story, keeps these echoes of the Imperium alive beyond the void. Add your voice to this gathering, so when the silence comes, it will not take everything with it. Chapter 1. The Silent Muster. The first sound that carried through the Vox was not a command, nor the resolute cadence of a trained orator. It was the faint crackle of interference, a long hesitation filled only by the static hiss of failing machinery. Then slowly, a voice emerged, hoarse, worn, stripped of all ceremonial flourish. "Citizens of Vadris," the planetary governor began, his words measured like the tolling of a bell. "I speak to you now not as your leader, but as one among you, sharing in your fate." The camera, if there truly was one, revealed a man framed against the faded grandeur of the governor's spire. Behind him, the banners of the Aquila drooped in tatters, their once proud gold reduced to soot-stained fabric. The chamber was dimly lit, as though even the lumen strips had begun to lose their strength. His eyes lingered not on the lens, but somewhere far away, as if the act of speaking to his people already felt like addressing the dead. Outside the spire, the capital had become a mausoleum, masquerading as a city. Once, the plazas of Vadris Prime had thrummed with the rhythm of workers changing shifts, of manufactoria chimneys, belching promethium smoke into the sky. Now, the air hung heavy with the acrid bite of rust and ash, the machines of industry fallen silent. Conveyor lines had ground to a halt, Vox pylons stuttered and failed. The soundscape of the city was no longer the clamor of survival, but the groaning quiet of things breaking down. The muster grounds below the spire bore the worst silence of all. Rows of hastily conscripted defenders stood in formation, their lasguns clutched like relics instead of weapons. Their silence was not born of discipline, but of exhaustion. Many had not eaten in days, their cheeks hollow beneath cracked visors, their bodies trembling in armor too heavy for their withered frames. Where once the Astra Militarum had paraded with iron resolve, now stood only remnants, half-trained militia, and those too desperate to flee. Their silence was not courage, it was emptiness. The governor's voice, though thin, reached into that emptiness. He recited the familiar phrases of loyalty, the duty of the tithe, the eternal watch of the emperor. Yet even as the words echoed across the Vox relays, they rang hollow. "We remain bound," he said, pausing as though searching for conviction in the pause itself. "To Terra, to the throne, to the Imperium that sustains us." But the silence that followed his declaration seemed louder than his words. In the hab blocks, families huddled close around dim glow lamps, straining to hear the broadcast through the static. Mothers pressed children tighter, not because the words promised safety, but because they knew safety no longer existed. In the manufactoria ruins, workers whose hands had known nothing but the endless cycle of production listened in disbelief. How could the Imperium demand more, when the furnaces were already cold? In the muster fields, soldiers shifted uneasily, their gaze flicking skyward to the faint scars of orbital vessels circling above. The governor's words, intended to bind them together, only underscored their isolation. Yet it was not outright rebellion that stirred in their silence. It was something heavier: resignation. The people of Vadris did not cheer, nor did they curse. They endured. That was their final act of faith. The silence became their muster, the only sound they could offer to a governor who no longer commanded armies, only ghosts. The broadcast continued, his voice gaining a rhythm that seemed half prayer, half apology. He recalled the names of regiments lost, of shipments never delivered, of promises made by off-world officials who would never return. He spoke of shortages not in numbers but in human terms. How many weeks since the last ration? How many families pressed into one hab unit? How many children vanished in the alleys? He named them, one by one, as though each syllable might keep their memory alive a little longer. The vox crackled again, drowning his voice for a moment, and in that wash of static, the city seemed to breathe out its collective despair. The silence that returned was no longer empty, it was waiting. Waiting for what? None could say. For rescue, for death, for the inevitable word the governor had not yet spoken. And still, the muster remained, silent. The governor's tone shifted as the minutes passed, though whether it hardened into defiance or crumbled into weariness was difficult to discern. His words flowed slower, like a river reaching the delta, where all things scatter and dissolve. This city, he said, the syllables catching in his throat, was once called the beating heart of Vadris. The manufactoria were our arteries, the plazas our breath, the tithe our pulse, and now it falters. Through the vox relays, his voice bled into places his gaze could not reach. In the upper hive, where steel walkways hung over yawning depths, the message rang hollow against rusted gantries. Vox speakers caked with grime sputtered his phrases, each word bouncing off walls, where gangs carved their marks in defiance of law. The governor's authority seemed almost laughable here, yet still, the people listened, their eyes reflecting the pale green glow of malfunctioning lumen strips. They listened not for guidance, but for confirmation of what they already feared, that no help was coming. Down in the sump levels, the broadcast was little more than static swallowed by the stench of sewage and oil. Yet even there, scavengers paused, water dripping from broken pipes above, listening as if to some distant funeral. Their silence was not reverence but recognition, the understanding that they were already forgotten, long before the Exterminatus order would ever arrive. Above all, the streets carried the quiet of abandonment. Shop fronts stood shuttered, their signs long since stripped for scrap. Piles of refuse rotted in corners, where the refuse servitors had ceased their circuits. The only movement came from the wind, pushing ash across flagstones once scrubbed clean for parades. A child's doll, its paint peeling, sat abandoned on the steps of an administratum office, a mute reminder that life here had not stopped suddenly but had drained away, drop by drop. The governor spoke of the tithes with a voice that seemed caught between duty and disbelief. We gave more than we could sustain, he admitted, and still it was not enough. Grain stripped from our fields, men and women stripped from their homes, promethium bled from our veins. We gave, and we gave, until the giving hollowed us. The words rang across the spire like a confession, though in the Imperium confession rarely brought absolution. The citizens felt the weight of his honesty like a blade pressing against skin. No one dared cheer, no one dared curse. The silence deepened, thick and suffocating, as though the entire world held its breath to avoid drawing notice. For in the Imperium, silence was safer than speech. At the muster fields, the conscripts shifted in their lines. One man dropped his lasgun, its clatter echoing far louder than it should have, heads snapping toward the sound, as though it were heresy itself. The governor did not pause, did not acknowledge the moment. Perhaps he could not hear it, perhaps he chose not to. He pressed on, naming the regiments drafted into wars across stars, regiments that had never returned. The 18th Vadran Rifles, the 39th, the 52nd, his voice caught with each number, as though the syllables themselves were carved from bone. All gone, and now only you remain. His words might have been meant as encouragement, but in the silence that followed, they became epitaphs. Soldiers looked to the sky, to the faint glimmer of orbital vessels tracing across the heavens. They knew what floated above them, even if no one dared speak its name. Bombardment platforms, Exterminatus warships, instruments of final judgment. A mother clasped her child tighter as the governor's words spilled through the Vox grill of their hab unit. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she would not let them fall. The child asked if the soldiers above would protect them, if the Emperor still watched, if the light still shone from Terra. The mother kissed the child's forehead, but her silence was answer enough. The governor's voice trembled. "We remain bound," he repeated, softer this time, "to Terra, to the throne." His words faded into static, and for a long moment, only the crackle remained. Then the Vox resumed, his voice rawer than before. "If this is loyalty, then let it be loyalty unto Ash." The silence after those words was unbearable. Not even the static dared intrude. The next interval of the broadcast arrived like a wound reopening. The Vox carried a deeper hum now, a subterranean tremor threading through the static, as if the city itself had begun to shiver. Dust drifted from the ceiling of the spire's chamber, settling on the governor's shoulders like the residue of old promises. He did not brush it away. "You asked me for truth," he said, more to the worn flagstones than to the lens. "I have none to give that will spare you." He looked thinner than he had minutes before, the light catching hollows beneath his eyes. At his elbow lay a data slate with its corners chipped, the display spider-webbed from too many hurried palms. The screen showed a tangle of administratum glyphs and munitorum codes, overlaid with urgent sigils, each stamped with authority that brooked no debate. He did not quote them. He only dragged one finger along the screen's edge, as if tracing a boundary he dared not cross. Outside, the capital continued its imitation of life. A pair of Arbites patrols moved like iron beetles through avenues abandoned to ash, visors opaque, shock mulls unlit, not for lack of will, but for lack of power. When they paused, it was to listen, not for criminals, but for something larger. The sky, far above the thin silver threads of orbiting hulls, left arcs that the naked eye could mistake for cirrus. Those who knew ships did not mistake them. Vessels did not linger in that pattern, unless they waited for an ending. At the muster fields, the conscripts tightened their ranks against a wind that smelled of cold metal and distant fires. An old sergeant, old only because he had managed to remain unclaimed by any off-world draft, walked the line with a gait that betrayed a bad knee and worse sleep. He did not shout. He adjusted a chin strap here, a loose sling there, the small dignities of men preparing for a spectacle they would not command. A boy with frost-white knuckles on his lasgun asked the sergeant if the ships above meant reinforcements. The sergeant examined the boy's weapon, as if it had posed the question. He nodded once, a movement so slight it could be mistaken for a twitch. The boy found a fragment of hope in that single lie, and held it like an ember in both hands. The governor began naming days the way men count beads on a rosary. Since the last off-world tithe ship, 48 days. Since the last functioning astropath burned himself empty to send our plea, 39. Since the last ration cart completed a full circuit of the lower halves without being stripped to the axles, 12. Each number landed with the certainty of a falling weight. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Numbers carried their own gravity. Somewhere in the bowels of the spire, a generator coughed and steadied, only to falter again. The lumen strips along the far wall guttered, then rallied to a paler glow. The governor leaned closer to the broken lens, and lowered his tone until the Vox had to chase his words. "Do not barter your faith for rumors," he said, as if the phrase itself had been rehearsed into him by duty. "Do not give your loyalty to shadows. If the Emperor tests us, we must be found unbroken." The sentence hung between plea and decree. He let it hang. He was not alone in the chamber. The camera caught the edge of a figure stepping into and out of frame, robes of deep charcoal, insignia obscured by a strip of cloth at the breast. The cut of the garment suggested administratum, but the posture did not. Whoever it was kept their hands tucked within their sleeves, a habit not learned from clerks. They spoke to the governor without voices, their presence an edit in the air, the kind that turns the lungs cold. The governor did not acknowledge them aloud, but his eyes flicked to the corner where they waited, and then away, as if light itself avoided that niche. The vox picked up the city's breath, a distant clatter of collapsing scaffolds, the roll of empty canisters along a gutter, the thin keening of wind through broken archways. In the sump levels, the broadcast found a niche of clarity, enough for a group of scavengers to hear the governor say a name, not his own. A regiment, the 18th Vadran Rifles, he said it once, and the scavengers glanced at each other in a reflex older than speech. One of them had a father who'd marched with the 18th, or so the story went. None asked where the father was now. In Vadras, questions had become a luxury like fresh water. He told a story then, brief, precise, and emptied of every embellishment, about the last train that left the Manufactorum quarter before the rails seized. Women and men had clung to the carriages, boots scraping sparks, trying to become cargo by sheer force of will. When the train finally stopped at the upper platform, there were fewer inside than had started, and more beneath the wheels than anyone could count. I was there, the governor said, voice tightening. I ordered the platform sealed to prevent riot. It prevented nothing. The confession came as if carved from him by the act of speaking. He did not offer absolution, only record. A second figure joined the first in the shadowed corner, this one bearing a small case stamped with a rosette that the lens could not fully resolve. It might have been a mere seal of office, worn by any number of imperial institutions. It might have been something rarer. The governor's gaze slid toward it, and then to the data slate, where the glyphs pulsed in a slow cadence, as if counting down a conversation he had not yet permitted himself to have. He spoke of the crop yields failing in the northern agrodomes after a coolant rupture, of the water towers in the east hive turning brackish, of a promethium fire that had lit the night for 3 days and could not be doused because the fire servitors had been cannibalized for parts. He did not say who had signed the requisition that led to those cannibals. He did not need to. The city's silence supplied the signature. Somewhere overhead, thunder passed without clouds. Those who knew the language of ships would have named it realignment, the slow swing of mass toward trajectory. In the muster field, the old sergeant's bad knee buckled for a heartbeat. He caught himself, and pretended it was the wind. The boy with the ember grip saw nothing but the sergeant's steadiness, and decided to live for another hour on that alone. The governor's voice thinned to a thread that still somehow held. If there is to be a reckoning, he said, it will find me speaking. He lifted the data slate, with hands that shook only when he thought they were hidden from view. The cracked screen reflected the torn aquila behind him, gold reduced to dull brass. His thumb hovered over the seal that waited like a blade above skin. The lens struggled to hold focus, the image having, doubling, then knitting itself back together, in a judder that made every viewer blink. He took in a breath that tasted of dust and old oil and fear disguised as duty. The figures in the corner did not move. The ships above did. The governor opened his mouth to speak the word he had not yet allowed himself, and the vox cut out in a burst of white shrapnel static that erased everything for one full, merciless heartbeat.
Chapter 2. Shackled beneath the Aquila. The Aquila above the courthouse steps had lost half its span. One wing torn away by a storm that was not weather, it hung crooked over a plaza, now given to ration queues and rumor. Beneath it, an Adeptus Arbites detachment held a line that needed holding only because the people believed it might still exist. Their visors were blank, their carapace armor scuffed, their shock mauls idle to conserve charge. They had counted their ammunition that morning, the way priests count prayer beads, slowly, with care, and with the knowledge that each bead once spent would not return. A vox amplifier mounted to a cracked column translated authority into noise. A proctor read the day's decrees as if intoning litanies carved into his lungs, Curfew maintained, water distributions rotated by Hab tier, unauthorized travel between levels prohibited, violations subject to penal labor conscription. He paused between each order, not for emphasis but to breathe through the taste of recycled air gone metallic. The crowd listened because listening was habit. They had long since ceased believing that the words would change. A child near the front tried to raise a hand. The mother caught it and lowered it gently, then drew the child against her side until the question dissolved into the warmth of a borrowed ration tin. Questions attracted attention. Attention attracted outcomes. Under the Aquila there was no safety in either. In a shadowed alcove beyond the cordon, a robed figure with a mechadendrite coiled beneath his sleeve watched the line with a gaze that clicked faintly as it refocused. A junior enginseer from the Manufactorum quarter, Hieronymus K Delta 7, self-identified by the stitch etch along his collar, took in the Arbites' power readouts and the plaza's lumen output the way a physician reads pulse. Power reserves across the plaza had fallen to a ratio he did not name aloud. He whispered Ben Herrick into a handvox anyway, a prayer like a maintenance schedule, and received only the empty chirp that means a relay has died somewhere far away. The governor's voice reached the plaza again, carried by a municipal speaker whose grill was clogged with the city's dust. He did not speak of hope, he spoke of measures. "We will maintain order," he said, which in a place like Vedrus meant that order would be maintained upon the bodies of those too tired to resist. He named the Arbites for their steadfastness and the Administratum for their diligence, pronouncements that sent a carefully neutral ripple through the line. Every citizen there had an account to settle with diligence. It had been debiting their lives for years. Behind the courthouse, the Arbites' barracks smelled of gun oil and boiled water. A senior judge sat at a steel desk scored by old impacts and older oaths, a data slate before her showing the map of the capital's arteries in cold lines. She traced a route with a gauntleted finger, the sump levels to the East Hive where rumor said the ration carts vanished into crowds that had mouths for hands. She had sent patrols there 3 nights running. 2 returned with cracked visors and empty belts. 1 did not return at all. The judge scraped a line in the desk with her nail, and told no one what the line meant. Her visor lay beside her, a mirror that offered no face. The governor climbed that same moment through the spire's inner stair, ascending past murals that depicted victories no one living had witnessed. Each step carried him through a decade of propaganda, the paint flaking as if the walls were done reciting. He paused at a landing where a lumen had died, and stood breathing the smell of brass fittings warmed by failing current. His attendants, those 2 gray figures who had lingered at the edge of the last broadcast, waited near his office door. One carried a case stamped with a sigil that the eye refused for a heartbeat before accepting. The rosette was small, and real, and heavier than its size permitted. Inside, the office had become a shrine to unfinished letters. Sealed missives to the Segmentum command lay stacked like small tombs. A reply from the Administratum, dry and exact, informed him that Vedrus tithe debt exceeded approved variance, and that corrective measures would be required to restore compliance. The governor read that phrase again, a man committing a sentence to memory because it is the blade he must hold by the edge. Corrective measures. He looked to the case by the door and did not open it. From the balcony he could see the muster fields where the conscripts held their breath as if summoned to do so by the sky. The old sergeant moved among them, a steady line in a world that had learned to twist. The governor tried to imagine a speech that would make that man's knees stop hurting. He tried to imagine a speech that would keep the ships above from finishing their medic's calm arithmetic. He tried, and when the words would not materialize, he did the thing left to those who have no orders strong enough to bind a planet. He spoke a smaller truth and hoped it would behave like a larger one. "Citizens of Vedrus," he said, letting the vox catch him only after the breath before the words, "you are told that obedience is our shield. It is, but it is also the shackle that keeps us from falling into the abyss. If you must choose between silence and riot, choose the silence that keeps your children breathing." The statement had the shape of mercy and the taste of surrender. He allowed both to stand. In the plaza, the proctor lowered his amplifier and listened to the governor's sentence echo in the stone. A thin man 2 places back in the ration queue shifted his weight and glanced at the alley where a figure in threadbare robes whispered to a cluster of listeners too intent to be casual. The words slithered along the edge of audibility. The Emperor tests us. The Emperor has abandoned us. The Emperor has become a god who demands smoke rather than bread. Heresy was a term of art in Vadris now. It described the exact moment when hunger turns language into flint and strikes. The proctor raised his amplifier again and announced the next block's distribution schedule. No one moved. Waiting had congealed into the habit that replaced living. The engine seer in the alcove clicked once and turned away to find a relay that still remembered how to obey. In the spire, the governor took the case from the gray-robed attendant with both hands. The rosette caught a slant of light and marked his skin with authority. Inside lay a data wafer sealed in red wax and a strip of parchment that had never been near parchment. The seal carried a sigil older than his family's title. He knew before he broke it that the words would not be his to refuse. He stared through the open doors to the balcony, to the bent Aquila and the mustered silence below, and he thought, if obedience is the shield and the shackle both, then the hand that holds the chain is not mine. The wafer slid into the reader with a sound like a tooth seeding into old bone. Glyphs rose in disciplined rows, each word a mechanism that only turned one way. The ships above continued their slow, patient drift.
The governor did not read the wafer's glyphs aloud, though their weight entered his voice as he returned to the balcony. The case closed with a sound too soft for the vox, yet every listener felt the change when he began again. We are commanded, he said, to endure, not because we can, but because we must. The ledger of the Imperium tolerates no deficit. His hand tightened on the rail until the knuckles went pale. Below, the muster field seemed to shrink, soldiers drawing closer as if their bodies could hear what the words refused to say. Obedience had become a currency more precious than promethium. Every man, woman, and child knew that to question the tithe was to step into absence, vanishing into Arbites' custody, or worse, into the administratum's unending bureaucracy. Entire families had disappeared from the lower halves without notice, their rooms reassigned within a day, their names scrubbed from records as though they had never existed. This was loyalty in Vadris now, to vanish when told, to silence one's hunger, to bear shackles willingly because they carried the Aquila's stamp. At the plaza, the crowd had begun to fragment into eddies of whisper. Some leaned toward the robed speaker in the alley, hunger etching their eyes sharper than knives. Others pressed closer to the Arbites' cordon, not to fight but to be seen, as though visible submission might spare them. The Arbites' visors did not shift, their line unbroken, though each heartbeat counted against dwindling energy reserves. Their silence was iron, but inside their helmets, lips pressed to prayers or to curses. One Arbites enforcer, his badge scoured nearly smooth, shifted his stance and whispered the catechism of judgment under his breath. His vox grill was muted, but his voice carried into his skull, reminding him that his life was the Emperor's instrument. He did not notice his power pack register a deficit warning. He would not allow himself to notice. To disbelieve in the charge was to disbelieve in judgment itself. Above them, the ships altered course, their silhouettes darkened, no longer gleaming arcs but black masses eating the stars. The crowd saw it, even if none spoke. A tremor passed through the lines, not of sound but of shared recognition. Something awaited above them, as merciless as mathematics. Back in the spire, the governor's attendants finally moved. The gray-robed figure extended a parchment slip for him to sign. His eyes scanned the lines, the signatures of Segmentum Command. He appended notations of Adeptus Ministorum approval, the sigil stamped at the bottom that none dared misinterpret. He held the stylus for a long moment, then lowered it. The wax cracked beneath his mark. The room seemed to tilt, as though the planet itself had flinched. The vox carried his next words more cleanly, almost reverently, as though the machines themselves had chosen to steady for the moment. We are ordered to persist until the last ration is consumed, the last breath spoken in his name. That is our covenant. We have no right to ask for reprieve. His eyes closed against the words, but his lips shaped them flawlessly, every syllable echoing doctrine. In the sump levels, the scavengers shook their heads and muttered. Persistence meant nothing to those already gnawing on roots and rust. A woman spat on the Vox pylon, and muttered that the Emperor's covenant fed only terra. Her companions laughed, sharp and brittle, their sound echoing through dripping tunnels. Yet none of them dared strike the machine itself. Even hunger bowed before the Aquila's shadow. On the muster fields, the old sergeant repeated the governor's final phrase aloud. "We have no right to ask for reprieve." The conscripts murmured it back, not in belief, but because repetition itself was safer than silence. The boy with the ember grip whispered it, as though words might shield him. His last gun's power cell clicked when he checked it. The charge bar was nearly gone. He closed his eyes and prayed that no one else had heard the click. The governor turned from the balcony, his shoulders slumping, the rosette's weight pulling him down as surely as chains. His attendants waited by the sealed case, expressionless, hands folded. He could not tell if they were custodians or executioners. Perhaps they were both. Far above, a single light flared against the void. Not a star, not rescue. A calibration burned from one of the orbiting warships. Its fire fell like a second dawn, painting the bent Aquila in bloodlight. The people in the plaza craned their heads, each throat tight with words that could never be spoken. Shackles held, shackles always held, until the hand that held them opened.
The governor did not read the wafer's glyphs aloud, though their weight entered his voice as he returned to the balcony. The case closed with a sound too soft for the Vox, yet every listener felt the change when he began again. "We are commanded," he said, "to endure, not because we can, but because we must." The ledger of the Imperium tolerates no deficit. His hand tightened on the rail until the knuckles went pale. Below, the muster field seemed to shrink, soldiers drawing closer as if their bodies could hear what the words refused to say. Obedience had become a currency more precious than promethium. Every man, woman, and child knew that to question the tithe was to step into absence, vanishing into Arbites' custody, or worse, into the administratum's unending bureaucracy. Entire families had disappeared from the lower habs without notice, their rooms reassigned within a day, their names scrubbed from records as though they had never existed. This was loyalty in Vadris now, to vanish when told, to silence one's hunger, to bear shackles willingly, because they carried the Aquila's stamp. At the plaza, the crowd had begun to fragment into eddies of whisper. Some leaned toward the robed speaker in the alley, hunger etching their eyes sharper than knives. Others pressed closer to the Arbites' cordon, not to fight but to be seen, as though visible submission might spare them. The Arbites' visors did not shift, their line unbroken, though each heartbeat counted against dwindling energy reserves. Their silence was iron, but inside their helmets, lips pressed to prayers or to curses. One Arbites enforcer, his badge scoured nearly smooth, shifted his stance and whispered the catechism of judgment under his breath. His Vox grill was muted, but his voice carried into his skull, reminding him that his life was the Emperor's instrument. He did not notice his power pack register a deficit warning. He would not allow himself to notice. To disbelieve in the charge was to disbelieve in judgment itself. Above them, the ships altered course, their silhouettes darkened, no longer gleaming arcs but black masses eating the stars. The crowd saw it, even if none spoke. A tremor passed through the lines, not of sound but of shared recognition. Something awaited above them, as merciless as mathematics. Back in the spire, the governor's attendants finally moved. The gray-robed figure extended a parchment slip for him to sign. His eyes scanned the lines, the signatures of Segmentum Command. He appended notations of Adeptus Ministorum approval, the sigil stamped at the bottom that none dared misinterpret. He held the stylus for a long moment, then lowered it. The wax cracked beneath his mark. The room seemed to tilt, as though the planet itself had flinched. The Vox carried his next words more cleanly, almost reverently, as though the machines themselves had chosen to steady for the moment. We are ordered to persist until the last ration is consumed.
the last breath spoken in his name. That is our covenant. We have no right to ask for reprieve. His eyes closed against the words, but his lips shaped them flawlessly, every syllable echoing doctrine. In the sump levels, the scavengers shook their heads and muttered. Persistence meant nothing to those already gnawing on roots and rust. A woman spat on the Vox pylon, and muttered that the Emperor's covenant fed only terror. Her companions laughed, sharp and brittle, their sound echoing through dripping tunnels. Yet none of them dared strike the machine itself. Even hunger bowed before the Aquila's shadow. On the muster fields, the old sergeant repeated the governor's final phrase aloud. We have no right to ask for reprieve. The conscripts murmured it back, not in belief, but because repetition itself was safer than silence. The boy with the ember grip whispered it, as though words might shield him. His last gun's power cell clicked when he checked it. The charge bar was nearly gone. He closed his eyes and prayed that no one else had heard the click. The governor turned from the balcony, his shoulders slumping, the rosette's weight pulling him down as surely as chains. His attendants waited by the sealed case, expressionless, hands folded. He could not tell if they were custodians or executioners. Perhaps they were both. Far above, a single light flared against the void. Not a star, not rescue. A calibration burned from one of the orbiting warships. Its fire fell like a second dawn, painting the bent Aquila in bloodlight. The people in the plaza craned their heads, each throat tight with words that could never be spoken. Shackles held, shackles always held, until the hand that held them opened.
Chapter 3. Whispers in the Void. The first unclean signal arrived as a pulse that pretended to be weather. It slid along the city's battered Vox lattice with the patience of frost, laying itself over official channels so thinly that a tired operator might mistake it for the low hum of a tower, finding its resonance. The hum became a syllable, the syllable a breath, and then the breath broke apart into a chorus of almost words that made the hair lift along the arms of anyone close enough to hear. It was not language so much as the memory of language, the way a lullaby sounds through a wall when you were never the child who slept beyond it. Ingenseer Hieronymus K Delta 7 registered the anomaly on 3 failing scopes, and a 4th he had talked back to life with prayers and wire. In the sump relay, his augmetic eye ticked through spectrums that did not belong to Vedras. The signal had no ident rune, no proper handshake, no stamp of the Astra Telepathica. It wove itself between sanctioned frequencies with the slyness of water finding the lowest course. He pinged the spire with a tight beam coded as maintenance priority, and again received the answer that had become customary, the dignified absence of reply. He turned the gain wheel a degree and heard, beneath the wash, a child's voice reciting a catechism that had never been written. He let go of the wheel. The voice disappeared as if it had been embarrassed. On the muster fields, the old sergeant woke before his name was spoken. He sat up from a dream in which the parade ground had become a shallow sea of mirror-black oil, and found his knee hurting in the familiar way that told him the weather had not changed. The boy with the ember grip lay a few meters away, his lasgun hugged like a relic. The sergeant watched the boy's chest rise and fall and decided not to wake him with a lie about the dawn. In the east, a low smolder hid the horizon as if the world refused to show where it ended. The governor heard the whisper too, though no device in his office should have carried it. He had slept for a time without consenting to it, head bent on an administratum ledger, whose arithmetic had replaced blood with columns. The sound brought him upright, heart hammering with the unreasoning panic of a man who expects to find another's breath in the room. There was no one. The attendants had left him to the rosette and the wafer, which sat on the desk like an unmoving verdict. He crossed to the balcony and listened. The city returned his attention with the usual replies: wind through broken arches, far clatters of metal against metal, a dog's brief, apologetic bark, and beneath it all, a shape of rhythm trying to arrange itself into words. It could have been the breath of ships. It could have been the last stubborn machinery of hope, dying. At the Arbites barracks, the senior judge took reports that refused to become a single picture. Vox hail from a patrol in the lower habs, intermittent, signal lost, recovered,
lost again. A cursory ping from a manufactorum sub-level, voices singing in a language the Auspex could not translate, followed by a metallic percussion that might have been ritual, or might have been pipes, shaking themselves loose. A single short-range beacon from beyond the river, the signature of a shuttle that should have died months ago, now blinking the same 3 glyphs, and then going dark, as if ashamed of its insistence. She lifted her visor and pressed the heel of her hand to her brow, feeling the slow ache of a migraine that could not be allowed the dignity of a name. Log them, she told the clerk, all of them. The clerk asked for headings, she said after a pause, unresolved. The clerk nodded as if this were a direction. Hieronymus routed the whisper to a dead-end buffer, and listened with the part of himself that still remembered lying perfectly still while a magos etched fresh circuitry along the curve of his skull. Among the not words, he heard a cadence, and in the cadence a pattern, and in the pattern, a deliberate avoidance. Whatever spoke did not wish to be found by the places it was speaking to. He tried a benediction of the Omnissiah, feeding the phrase into the line the way a man slides a coin beneath a locked door, and for a moment the hum aligned with his prayer. The relay's lights steadied. Then the pattern shrugged his coin back out, and continued, polite as rain. In the plaza, the whisperer of the alley lifted his mutilated icon, and claimed the signal as proof that his ship had come. The crowd inhaled in one long hopeful breath that tasted like rust and bread dust. He said the words were an invitation. He said the faithful would hear their names. He said the emperor had sent messengers who did not need the Aquila because they carried a purer light. The proctor at the cordon marked the gathering on his slate, and did not move his line. There were only so many directions to look at once, and the sky had begun to resemble a doctrine with no space for footnotes. The governor leaned on the balcony rail until the rust printed his palms in flaking crescents. He thought of astropaths whose eyes bled for messages that did not reach, of administratum clerks, who sent orders to hives whose maps had been eaten by moisture and time, of ministorum priests who preached marrow out of bones and called it grace. If the whisper had words, it kept them between teeth. If it had orders, they were addressed to someone else. A single light strobed high above the city, then vanished, then strobed again further west like a heartbeat moving through a body the size of a world. The sergeant saw it through the gap in the barracks roof, and did not try to read it. The boy woke and asked if it was a signal. Everything is a signal, the sergeant said, then softened. Eat. He offered a ration strip that tasted of paper and sleep. The boy chewed and made a face and kept chewing because obedience still had a shape he understood. Hieronymus cut the gain altogether, and the whisper persisted, not through the line but around it, the way water finds the cracks in a wall that has been mended too many times. He realized then that the city's silence had never been empty, it had only been patient. He set his palms flat on the relay housing and felt vibration traveling through steel and into bone. He thought of the Aquila above the courthouse with one wing torn away, and decided that symbols can fly in circles if necessary. In the spire, the governor returned to his desk and lifted the wafer without feeding it to the reader. He balanced it on his fingertips as if testing its mass, which was absurd, because the mass of such things is measured in outcomes. He said, to no one, if I speak your name, what will you make of me? The wafer refused to answer. The whisper did not. The vox net across Vadris thrummed once, twice, a third time, and for a breath the hum resolved into a sentence that could have been a prayer or a warning, or simply a misheard order from another dying city. Then it broke apart again, leaving the taste of copper on every tongue that had listened.
The river became the city's new horizon, a sheet of black water that carried echoes more faithfully than stone. At dusk, when the appointed hour arrived, they gathered mothers clutching children, men carrying packs that sagged with heirlooms instead of food, the whisperer leading them with his mutilated icon raised like a beacon. The proctor and his Arbites detail stood at the far end of the span, visors blank, shock mauls at their hips, amplifiers ready to turn law into thunder. Between them stretched the bridge, slick with condensation, trembling under so many feet. The city seemed to hold its breath, and in the silence the whisper threaded itself thicker, louder,
until every ear heard it as their own thought. "Come," it said again, but now the word had weight. It vibrated the metal railings, shuddered in the marrow, left a copper tang on tongues. Some claimed to see a shimmer above the river, a long shape lowering itself through the smoke-veined clouds, a ladder of light, or a column of fire. Others saw only the stars, indifferent and fixed, and wondered whether madness was contagious through sound. The governor listened from the balcony, his fingers pressed to the rust until flakes crumbled away. He had ordered a watch set on the eastern span, had commanded that the gathering be dispersed without blood if possible. He told himself he was still governor, that words still drew boundaries around lives. Yet as he watched, the crowd did not break, the Arbites did not advance, and the whisper continued as though none of them had authority at all. The rosette on his desk glowed faintly in the candlelight, a symbol of orders he had not yet spoken but could not silence. Hieronymus K Delta 7 traced the signal to the water itself. His auspex array, jury-rigged with copper strips and fragments of old relays, mapped the interference as concentric circles radiating outward from the river's center. He reported this in Bin Herrick to the spire. Though no reply came, he pressed his forehead against the cold steel of the relay, and whispered to the Omnissiah that rivers should not carry voices, only data, only boats, only the drowned. The whisper answered with laughter pitched just above the range of his augmetic ear. The old sergeant brought his conscripts to the bridge's edge, their boots ringing dully against the plates. He told them they were there to observe, to remind the Arbites that the city still had muscle to muster. But he knew better. He had lived long enough to smell what happened when the sky and the river both began speaking at once. He felt his knee ache as if marking time to an enemy's drum. The boy with the ember grip asked if this was the rescue the governor had promised. The sergeant gave no answer. Lies taste worse when your mouth is already dry. The senior judge arrived with a file of Arbites reinforcements, her visor gleaming red in the lumen spill. She surveyed the bridge, the whisperer's crowd, the proctor's unmoving line. The voice of the void thrummed louder, insinuating itself into every rib and lung. Her slate displayed a dozen violations, each carrying the penalty of immediate sanction. She looked at the whisperer, at the faces around him lit with desperation that had learned to disguise itself as devotion. She did not raise her weapon. She did not need to. The sky above had begun to glow with the measured light of thrusters correcting course. The crowd saw it, and cried out, each cry a plea or a hymn indistinguishable. The whispers swelled to fill the world. Some heard their names, some heard orders, some heard nothing but the hum of inevitability. The Arbites' line shifted a step forward, amplifiers crackling to life, but the judge held up one gauntleted hand. "Not yet," she said, and though the vox carried her words to no one but her men, the whisper stuttered for the first time, as if surprised to find competition. From his balcony, the governor whispered to himself the word he had never spoken aloud to his people, Exterminatus. It left his mouth like a confession, and clung to the air like smoke. The ships above answered, not with fire, not yet, but with silence deeper than any silence the city had known. On the river, the shimmer resolved into nothing, into everything, into the image each heart most needed to see. And the whisper, sweet as ash on the tongue, spoke once more, "Come."
Chapter 4. The veil of the sanctioned the decree, arrived in the spire, long before dawn, carried not by couriers or vox, but by the presence of a seal that shimmered faintly with its own authority. The governor woke to find it already on his desk, the rosette burned into parchment, as if the wax itself had been bled from the sigil. His attendants did not say how it had come. They never did. He broke it with a hand that trembled, though not from surprise. By now, nothing arrived without the taste of finality. The message within was brief, each line carved with the economy of law. The world was under sanction. All broadcasts henceforth would be reviewed. All communications to orbit were restricted. Authority on matters of faith, law, and war, was no longer the governor's alone, but shared with agents unnamed, unsmiling, unseen. He read it twice, though once had been enough. The veil had settled. From now on, silence could speak louder than truth. The attendants bowed when he looked up, their hands still hidden within their sleeves. Behind their courtesy lay the knowledge that he had become little more than an instrument. He had been permitted a voice so far only because his voice served as cover for the words others did not wish to own. He wondered if the broadcasts carried his tones at all, or if they had already been adjusted, altered, parsed into doctrine by mechanisms whose operators had no names. Outside, the plaza had grown gaunt with vigil. The whisperers' flock had thinned in the night. Some were gone to the river, some to the alleys, some to graves no one would mark. Yet still the Arbites held their line, and still the people gathered as though repetition itself could form a barricade. The proctor read decrees with the voice of a man who could not tell whether the words came from his own lungs or from some parchment in a spire chamber far above him. Each decree struck like a hammer, and still the silence between each was heavier. The senior judge now walked among the ranks herself, no longer content with relayed reports. She carried the slate in one hand, her sidearm in the other, and her visor remained down. The city reflected in that black glass, broken and incomplete, 1,000 faces merging into none. Obedience, she intoned when a woman dared to ask what crime hunger had become. Obedience is the measure. The woman lowered her gaze and pressed her lips shut until the question dissolved into blood where her teeth met her tongue. Hieronymus K. Delta 7, hunched over the relay in the sump, received his own instructions sealed with authority he dared not question. He was to suppress the anomalous signal by all means, and if suppression failed, to isolate it from the voxnet entirely. He traced the glyphs with one augmetic finger, reading them again to be certain, then offered a prayer that tasted more like apology. He had no tool sharp enough to cut the whisper without cutting the sanctioned broadcasts that now draped the city like a pall. He tried anyway, splicing wires with a care that bordered on reverence, knowing that failure itself might be interpreted as heresy. The governor returned to the balcony and spoke once more, though his words no longer belonged wholly to him. He began with loyalty to Terra, to the throne, to the Imperium's justice. His throat caught as the sanctioned phrases unfurled with a rhythm too exact to be mistaken for human breath. "Our faith is tested," he recited, his voice steadier than his hands. "We will be weighed, and those who falter will be found wanting. We are to endure, we are to persist, we are to obey." In the hab blocks, families pressed closer to the vox pylons as the sanctioned cadence washed over them. Some felt comforted, mistaking severity for strength. Others wept in silence, knowing these were not the words of a governor who had once walked their streets, but the litany of something distant, merciless, and satisfied. The mother with the child clutched her little one tighter. The boy asked if the emperor himself had spoken. She did not answer. The veil of the sanctioned had fallen, and with it, the city felt smaller, thinner, less its own. Every voice had become suspect, every silence suspect still. And above, the ship circled with the patience of predators already sated, waiting only for the signal that would allow them to kill without hunger. The sanctioned cadence did not end with the governor's broadcast. It propagated, replicating itself through municipal speakers that had never sounded so crisp. Words that had begun in one mouth now belonged to a chorus without faces. Notices appeared on courthouse columns and hab stairwells, stamped in red wax that smelled faintly of incense and machine oil. The seals bore no names, only the authority of the sigils impressed upon them. Curfews narrowed, permits multiplied, confession hours lengthened until they became the only hours left that resembled community. In the barracks, the senior judge gathered her proctors in a room whose walls had been scrubbed until the metal shone with the dull gleam of tired zeal. She placed a single document on the table. No one reached for it. The judge read the lines aloud, each clause measured, each citation precise,
her voice steadying as law did its old work of turning ambiguity into process. The order authorized detentions under suspicion of unauthorized auditory assemblies, a phrase that made even the most literal of her enforcers glance toward the ceiling, as if the air itself might be at fault. She signed at last, and when the stylus left the page her visor betrayed the faintest fog from a breath she had not meant anyone to see. By then the whisper had learned to move beneath the sanctioned litany, the way groundwater moves beneath paving stones. Hieronymus tried to peel one from the other, doctrine from murmur, without stripping both down to raw noise. He rigged a choke coil from the guts of a rusted lumen driver, bled his augmetics again in short, deliberate pulses, and fed the sanctioned signal a priority it could not be refused. The relay obeyed until the instant the whisper slipped sideways and reappeared in the untouched frequency band reserved for emergency notices. He stared at the gauge, as if willing it to remember its loyalties. The needle quivered once, twice, then settled at a reading that made no sense at all. He whispered a penitent's apology to the Omnissiah, not for failure, but for attempting a repair whose success would have left the city in a colder silence. The governor met with a delegation from the Ministorum in a chapel annex, whose windows depicted saints, whose miracles involved famine endured rather than cured. The priests brought censers, and their smoke took up space the way hope once had. They spoke of piety and scourge, of the sacred calculus that transforms suffering into proof. When the governor asked if they could dampen the fear gripping the hives, they offered amplifications of prayer instead. A canoness in waiting, young, rigid, eyes bright, with the sort of certainty that does not blink, intoned a sermon whose refrain was endurance. The governor heard the sanctioned cadence hiding beneath her tone, a second voice that steadied the first like a scaffold steadies a collapsing wall. He thanked them because thanks was a currency he could still spend without permission. The attendants moved more openly now. They did not announce themselves. They simply were occupying thresholds with the inertia of statues that had learned to breathe. One placed a slate on the governor's desk, and slipped back into the corridor with the economy of a blade returning to a sheath. The slate bore a single sentence, stamped with the rosette, its ink so black it looked wet. Prepare the populace for strategic evacuation protocols. The phrase curled in the mind like smoke, looking for a ceiling to stain. Evacuation to where? By what means? Under which mercy? He imagined the river bristling with landers that did not exist, the skies clogged with shuttles that had never been assigned. The only vehicles in abundance above Vadris were not meant for saving. At the courthouse, the Aquila's missing wing cast a shadow across the steps, like an hour that had been cut away. The proctor watched as citizens filed past to read the newest decrees. Some traced the wax with tentative fingers, as if heat might remain. A mother pressed a kiss to the seal, and whispered a thank you to a deliverance she could not define. The proctor marked her face in his memory, without understanding whether he was meant to protect her faith, or protect the city from it. He did not lift his visor. Today the catechism would have found his eyes unsure. Night narrowed the streets into alleys of doctrine. The sanctioned broadcasts adopted a new inflection, one that set the Vox unit's housings trembling. A voice generically male, generically calm, the kind of voice that does not need a face, announced that harboring unregistered transmitters would be treated as subversion. The whisperer's flock scattered from the plaza, and reconvened in rooms so low the ceiling scraped the scalp if you raised your head too fast. There bread was broken with neatness and shared in silence, and the mutilated icon lay face down on the tablecloth, as if ashamed of its own silhouette. When the whisper returned, it did so as a hush threaded with breath that was not quite human. The faithful flinched and did not stop listening. Hieronymus found himself drafting a report he would never send. He wrote that the signal bore signatures inconsistent with sanctioned Vox protocols, that it manifested in mediums that should have been inert, water rust blooms, the slow exhalations of old pipes. He wrote that it disguised itself as official only long enough to learn which gaps officialdom refused to name. He wrote that the city produced it as much as received it, the way a body produces fever. Then he deleted the lines, one by one, until only the header remained. Relay status, operational within sanctioned tolerances. He signed it. He experienced the unfamiliar sensation of cowardice and recognized it as a cousin of prudence. On the muster fields, the old sergeant read the new rules by the light of a guttering lamp. The boy asked what strategic evacuation meant. The sergeant considered the sky, the ships, the clean geometry of their orbit. He considered the river, the bridge, the crowd that had seen a ladder that never descended. He considered the way orders sometimes meant their opposite when spoken through sufficient layers of authority. "It means we will wait," he said at last, "and then we will move where we are told, and we will call that movement a plan." The boy nodded as if relieved to have a sentence he could carry without its edges cutting his hands. Toward dawn, the governor stood again on the balcony, the rosette a cold weight in his palm. The city's chorus braided itself below, sanctioned decree, ministorum chant, Arbites bootfall, whisper in the pipes, and for the first time he understood that the veil was not a curtain drawn by others but a cloth he had helped weave each time he exchanged clarity for order. He raised the rosette to the sky as if the ships might read it and lower themselves in gentleness. The ships did not move. Behind him an attendant cleared a throat that did not need clearing. The sound was as polite as a blade being set on velvet. The governor did not turn. He closed his fingers around the rosette until its edges bit, and blood bright as varnish marked the sigil's grooves. The sanctioned vox chose that moment to intone a fresh line, something about endurance rendered as mercy. The whisper replied from the river with a single, almost tender syllable that might have been agreement, might have been mockery, might have been nothing at all. The light along the horizon brightened without warmth.
By the second day under sanction, the city learned to hold its breath for longer intervals. Speech shortened to gestures. Gestures shortened to stillness. The sanctioned vox filled the gaps with a voice that never changed temperature. It spoke of audits that would preserve life by measuring it, of quarantines that would cleanse by isolating, of obedience that would heal by narrowing choice. The words stacked like crates in a corridor, leaving just enough passage for one body at a time. In the spire, the governor signed papers he did not draft and sealed orders he had not authored. The attendants laid each document before him, with the care of acolytes setting relics on an altar. He watched the rosette's impression multiply through wax and ribbon until the sigil seemed to repeat itself across his vision whenever he blinked. When he paused, an attendant's shadow lengthened over the desk like dusk arriving early. The message was not spoken. It did not need to be. The hand that writes is not the hand that decides. He asked for a single concession, the right to address the city in his own words, unfiltered, for 1 minute. The attendant considered the request as if weighing a reagent in an unseen scale. "You may have 30 seconds, came the reply, voiced without ownership. "The rest will be harmonized." He nodded and felt gratitude, which frightened him more than refusal would have. Down in the sump, Ensign Seer Hieronymus hunted an echo no chart could fix. He had sleeved the relay in a shell of scavenged copper plates, grounded the lines against the spire's lightning rods, and braided choke coils around the sanctioned channels until they sang in unison like disciplined choristers. Still the whisper returned through the riverbed stone, through condensation beating on pipes, through the skin's own thin antenna. He detected a faint subharmonic threaded through the sanctioned feed, a vanishingly small deviation that tugged at the ear like a lie told by someone you love. He could not prove intention, he could prove presence. He logged the anomaly and closed the log again, having written nothing. At the courthouse, the Aquila's broken wing clacked against its mount in the morning wind. The senior judge read the detention roster and felt its weight settle along the bones of her hand. Names had become lighter through attrition. There were fewer now to put in chains, and yet the chain's appetite persisted. She authorized a sweep of the East Hive's riverfront to disperse auditory assemblies. The proctor accepted the charge with a stiffness that tried for zeal and reached only fatigue. Behind him, the line adjusted gear with the ritual hum of men who know that procedure outlasts belief.
The Whisperer had changed venues. The plaza gave way to a granary storeroom, where sacks stood like mute parishioners in rows, their bellies caved by famine's arithmetic. He placed the mutilated icon beneath a sack's shadow and preached in a low cadence that braided sanctioned phrases into a new rope. Obedience as assent. Endurance as proof of chosen status. Evacuation not as logistics but as rapture conducted by ships that had no need of permits. A mother who had never been to the river closed her eyes and saw a ladder anyway. The human mind is generous with its scaffolding when the walls begin to list. Toward noon, the governor's 30 seconds arrived, paced out by an unseen hand. He stood on the balcony, the spire's wind straightening the torn banners behind him. Citizens of Vedras, he began, and for half a breath the sanctioned harmonics held back, allowing his voice to arrive naked. I see you. The words startled him by their smallness and by their truth. I have failed to feed you, he continued, and I have failed to keep our oaths from devouring our lives. Forgive me. The harmonics entered then, soft at first, then firm, taking his voice by the elbow the way a polite official escorts a drunk. Endure, it said with him. Persist, it said. Obey, it concluded. The governor closed his mouth and let the chorus finish the sermon he had not meant to give. On the muster field, the old sergeant heard only the first sentence and decided it was enough for one day. He repeated it to the boy with the ember grip, without adding or subtracting a word. The boy held the sentence like a ration you do not eat at once. He tucked it away and felt a little stronger for denying himself. The Arbites swept the riverfront at dusk. The proctor advanced with his files at a measured pace, amplifiers low, shock mauls unlit, visors down. The senior judge followed with her slate out, recording the positions of knots of people who had learned to resemble shadows when watched from the angle of law. The whisper greeted the sweep with civility, lowering itself to a purr that tickled the ear's inner bones. It spoke a word that could have been here or here, and the ambiguity made obedience wobble in its frame. Hieronymus intercepted a short-range burst that did not behave like rumor. A shuttle code blinked against the sanctioned grid, authentic but years out of date, its permissions stamped with the authority of a ship whose name the Planetary Registry had blacked out during a budget cycle no one remembered. He triangulated the ping to a repair gantry on the river's western bank, long abandoned, its ladders rusted through, its decking weeping brown streaks into the water. He sent the coordinates to the spire with a maintenance header only. The spire answered with a single syllable, noted. Night arrived with precision, as if obeying a curfew of its own. The sanctioned vox deepened its register until it became a floor. The whisper lifted a note higher, slipping between rafters and ribs, standing on tables and on the backs of men's teeth. At the granary gathering, the whisperer announced that tonight would show signs to those who had prepared their hearts and their pockets. He offered a list of names no one recognized, and said they were the first to ascend. A woman laughed, a tiny brittle sound, and clapped her hands over her mouth as if she had struck someone. The governor dreamed standing up. In his dream the rosette was not a seal but a mouth that chewed quietly, methodically, without swallowing. He woke to the sound of a door closing without a latch catching. One attendant remained in the room, the other vanished. The absence felt like a decision that had not been explained. On his desk lay a new wafer, thinner, colder to the touch, its wax stamped with the same sigil in a shade of black he had not seen before. He did not break it. He knew before he read it what sentence it contained, because he had been finishing it without ink for 2 days. On the river, something moved where light should not have been. The proctor saw it as a shiver in the reflection of the hive's broken teeth. The senior judge saw it as an arithmetic error that would not balance even if she borrowed from tomorrow's column. Hieronymus saw it as a line of code that refused to compile yet executed anyway. The sergeant felt it in his knee. In the spire, the governor lifted the unbroken wafer and held it to the candle's edge until the wax softened, threatening to blur the sigil. He stopped before it did. Mercy is a shape the hand recognizes and then chooses not to complete. The sanctioned vox drew breath for a new decree. The whisper drew breath with it.
Bang.
For half a heartbeat, both voices matched pitch so perfectly that the city heard a single tone that could have been law or prayer or the prelude to fire.
Chapter 5. Beyond the Golden Throne's Light. The night that followed did not feel like the others. It seemed to arrive from a direction the city had not accounted for, as if darkness could have a vector, and it had chosen to enter Vedras through the seam no cartographer had drawn. The sanctioned vox steadied into its floor tone. The whisper climbed to its perch upon the rafters of breath and bone, and above them both, the ships took up a silence, so deliberate it became architecture. The governor stood at the balcony, with the new wafer unbroken in his hand, and felt the world narrow, until the air between his chest and the rail became the only measurable distance left to him. Rumor, which had learned to dress itself in the robes of litany, said the Astronomicon had flickered. No one who said it could name a source, and yet the phrase spread like warmth through cold fingers. Flickered, an unthinkable verb applied to the light by which whole navies found their way. The Ministorum denied it with a passion that would have looked like faith if their eyes had not betrayed calculation. The Arbites ignored it with the professionalism of men who understand jurisdiction. The Administratum filed it under headings that ensured no one would ever find it again. The Whisperer embraced it and called it proof that the Emperor's gaze had shifted, that Vedras stood now in a quiet between breaths where chosen worlds are named. The governor listened and did not correct any of them. He had never seen the Astronomicon. He had only believed in it in the way a man believes in the bones of his own skull, by inference, by necessity, by the pressure it exerts on every thought. Engineer Hieronymus K Delta 7, shoulder to the relay, felt a pause travel the lines like a fish shadow beneath a river's skin. His instruments registered nothing, nothing measurable, nothing admissible, but his augmetic eye tremored once along its inner track, and he knew in the private way of technicians that something at the very edge of tolerances had glanced off the city and kept going. He whispered a hymn to the omnisia that replaced nouns with functions, the only language that did not embarrass itself when addressing infinity. In the hymn's last syllable, he tucked a small unmachined hope that Vedras's end, if it arrived, would be the clean ending of a line cut true, not the splintering of a rotten beam. On the muster field, the old sergeant rose with the men and found his knee merely painful, not articulate.
Aye.
The sky above the hive wore a faint bruise along one rim, the kind that tells a soldier the horizon has already said yes to something. He walked the ranks, adjusted a strap, pinned a sleeve, answered the boy's question about whether prayers mattered with a sentence so practiced it no longer hurt to say, "They matter to the men who say them." The boy nodded, unconvinced, but relieved by the rhythm. He checked his power cell, saw the bar wobble, and smiled without humor. "Everything flickers," he told the sergeant, and the sergeant decided not to ask where he had heard it. The senior judge took her place at the courthouse steps and read the morning decrees with a voice that did not waste sound. When she finished, she kept the slate in her hand instead of returning it to the clerk. The plaza was thinly peopled, the riverfront quieter than rumor warranted. The granary congregation had split into smaller, more portable faiths, each carrying its own ladder the way a man carries a memory he has decided to make real. The proctor approached with a short report, disturbances minimal, compliance acceptable, 2 arrests under the new auditory statutes, no resistance offered. The judge nodded and dismissed him, then stared up at the maimed Aquila, and wondered, not for the first time, not aloud, whether symbols that cannot be mended must be retired, or made to work as they are, permanently off balance, one wing beating the air harder than the other. In the spire, the governor laid the unbroken wafer flat, and circled it with the candle, watching its shell take on a sheen like sweat.
He
Wanted to speak to his people without the harmonics, wanted to ask them whether any of them had seen the light at the center of everything dim for the breadth of a blink. Not because their answers would be admissible, but because asking would make him someone again. His attendants waited in their doorways, like punctuation. When he rose, they straightened. When he sat,
they became wall shadows. He felt a surge of anger so pure it frightened him, a clean, bright thing that might have been useful if there had been any tool to lay it against. The whisper declared that an hour had been named. It flowed across the city with the ease of a rumor that indulges no contradictions. It did not say whose hour, or appointed by whom. It said only that the river would make a path, and the sky would answer. The Arbites arrayed a cordon along the spans with competence that did not need faith to function. The proctor checked his charge and found it steady for once, as if even the pack desired to behave on such a day. He tasted metal, thought of the catechism, and kept his men's visors down. Hieronymus triangulated another shuttle code, again authentic, again obsolete, as it winked in and out like a man practicing the word here. He sent the coordinates with an urgency he did not name, and received another noted. He considered sending it to the judge as well, and did not. Men are shaped by the channels they are allowed. He had been permitted maintenance and arranged his life accordingly. The mother and child from the Hab block reached the river with a crowd that tried to avoid being a crowd. She carried the child on her hip, and a small bag over her shoulder, containing a cup, a photo, and a mass candle stub scrounged from a chapel, where miracles had become less specific. The child asked if ladders could be invisible, and still be ladders. She said yes without thinking, then added, "If you feel the rung under your foot, it counts." The child accepted this, because it had the structure of law. The governor lifted the wafer, and with a steadiness that belonged to another man, pressed his thumb into the wax. The seal yielded. Inside, a single line in black that drank the candlelight. By authority vested, enact final protocol when assets signal. He closed his eyes. He did not know what counted as an asset now. He did not know whether the signal would be a light, a word, a tone in the vox that pretended to be prayer. He set the wafer down, and opened his mouth to say one sentence to the city that would be his, even if the harmonics devoured it in the saying. Above Vedras, the ships altered their geometry by a fraction too small for citizens to see, and too large for the world to survive if carried to its conclusion. In that subtle turn lived the total of 1,000 signatures, and the quietus of 1,000,000 names. The whisper felt it, and adjusted its own pitch like a choirboy, finding the priest's note. The sanctioned vox inhaled. The river stiffened as if a hand had pressed flat upon its back. For the space of a heartbeat, something like a light, not seen, but understood, moved through the city, as if the emperor's radiance had touched Vedras, in the manner of a glance through a crowded cathedral. Those who felt it disagreed at once about what it had been: a blessing, a warning, a failure in the power grid, a rumor proving itself to the length of a breath. The mother told the child to hold tight. The sergeant said nothing at all. Hieronymus reached to steady a gauge that did not need steadying. The judge lifted her visor half a thumb, and let the air touch her eyes. The governor spoke into the vox, and for the first half of the first word, the harmonics were not quick enough to find him. Ford.
The harmonics caught him on the second syllable, and clothed the word in doctrine. Forgiveness became endurance. Absolution became procedure, and the city received a sermon where a confession should have been. The governor stood very still, letting the chorus walk his voice to the end of the sentence it preferred. When it released him, a breath too late, he did not try again. The wax from the broken wafer cooled in a thin crescent against his thumb, shaping itself to his print, as if memorizing him for later. A new light kindled along the higher cloud deck, neither dawn nor flame, but the hush of engines transitioning their appetite. The Arbites along the spans adjusted their stance as one organism. The proctor toggled his amplifier, and heard only the floor tone of the sanctioned vox purring under everything. A cat that had decided the house belonged to it. Maintain spacing, he told his men, and the command sounded smaller than it had yesterday, though it was the same number of words. On the western bank, the repair gantry that should have been a ruin flickered with a promise it could not keep. A shuttle's ghost sat in the scaffolding, its outline etched by memory and wish, winking in and out with the patience of a liar who believes his audience wants to be convinced. Engine seer Hieronymus stared at the auspex, then at the river, then at his own hands, and chose the few things he knew:
The signal bore authentic formatting from a ship that did not exist here. The interference climbed when people listened harder. The sanctioned feed steadied in proportional response. He sent one more maintenance-coded ping to the spire, and received a reply that was a silence shaped like permission. In the courthouse plaza, the senior judge raised her visor at last, and let the morning's grit sting her eyes. The list on her slate asked to be a verdict, but would remain an inventory. She felt the city's sound become thinner, as if someone had opened a valve in the sky. "Proctor," she said, "no further dispersals at the river, unless violence begins by other hands." He inclined his head, relief moving through his shoulders like a quiet exhale. Law sometimes knows when to choose its own limits. The whisperer at the granary chose that same moment to unveil the icon upright. The crowd saw, for the first time, the whittled Aquila, with its second head pared down to a scar, and the laurels recast as nails. A murmur passed through the room, not of horror but of recognition, the way a man recognizes a face in a mirror after losing a tooth. "We are not divided," the whisperer said. "We are simplified. We become what ascends. Bread no longer strictly bread, touched lip and tongue and belief in careful portions." The mother with the child had come late. She took nothing but remembered the shape of the ritual, so that if asked, she could claim to have eaten. The governor crossed his office and stopped before the portrait, whose varnish had yellowed into sermon. He had once loved that painting for its insistence that the office outlasted the now he disliked it for the same reason. He imagined removing it from the wall, imagined the empty rectangle of bare stone breathing easier, and then remembered that his hands belonged to signatures. The attendants hovered in the doorway, their sleeves a geometry of patience. He turned his back on them because it was the nearest defiance left. Hieronymus left the sump for the first time in days, rising through stairwells that smelled of old soup and rust and incense. The city felt new the way a scar feels new, bright, tender, certain of itself. He walked to the river with the gait of a man not yet accustomed to carrying his full weight again. The gantry's ghostly shuttle blinked, the crowd inhaled, the sanctioned vox took a breath to correct their expectation. He closed his eye, the human one, and listened with the augmetic alone. The whisper threaded the water, and said a word he knew as a term of art, a line. It could have meant orbit, it could have meant hearts, it could have meant the angle at which a blade should enter. On the muster field, the old sergeant counted his men, and found them the same number as the day before, which felt like a victory large enough to be superstitious. He dismissed them to breakfast, and kept the boy with the ember grip by a hesitation that had learned to call itself instinct. "When the order comes," he said, not specifying which, "you will remember this: there is dignity in moving correctly, when you cannot choose whether to move." The boy nodded, and failed to understand in the useful way that keeps a heart unbroken a few minutes longer. The sanctioned vox introduced a new clause with a gravity that made teeth ache. Under authority of final protocol, it intoned, "All ships will observe silence until assets signal. Citizens will maintain places of safety. Evacuation corridors will be announced." The words did not say there would be corridors, they said there would be announcements. The distinction passed through the city like a thin wire someone had strung across a hallway at throat height. On the balcony, the governor leaned out into wind that smelled faintly of lubricant and old smoke. His 30 seconds had been spent. He still had a face. He tried out a sentence silently, and found it fit nowhere. He turned instead to the task left to men in his position. Since the unification wars, he began to choose which histories the city would remember if it survived. Names, places, the small bravery of an old sergeant with a bad knee, the precise competence of a judge who measured her zeal and kept limits, the stubborn decency of an engine-seer who had cannibalized light to keep hearing. He mouthed them so that if the vox recorded only the harmonics, the world might still retain a shape of the truth in the motion of his lips. The Arbites line along the spans loosened by a fraction as the proctor permitted men to adjust straps and drink water. The crowd did not rush the gap. They had learned that hope which hurries trips on its own hem. The river lifted its skin to a breeze, and shook a ladder of ripples out toward the western gantry. The shimmer brightened, darkened, vanished. A single sound followed, the mechanical cough of something old taking a breath, or a man convinced to live one more minute than planned. The senior judge's slate pinged. A code scrolled that she had never seen, 3 glyphs, not quite imperial, not quite machine, tidy as an accountant's smile. She felt unexpectedly like a child hearing her name called by a voice she could not place. She looked up. The broken Aquila creaked on its pin, as the wind decided nothing. Hieronymus crouched at the river's edge and touched the water with 2 fingers, then put them to his tongue as if calibrating salt. He tasted metal and rumor, and beneath both, something like the tiniest remainder after a long division has been worked through to exhaustion. He laughed once, softly, in the privacy engineered men reserve for blasphemy. "All right," he told the river. "I hear you." The river did not promise anything back. Above, the ships completed their fractional adjustments and held. A new stillness nested inside the previous one, a box within a box. The whisper lowered itself to a near inaudible murmur, satisfied for the moment. The sanctioned vox repeated its clause and added nothing. The city stood between 2 breaths again, no wiser and somehow more awake. The governor's thumb, with its crescent of cooled wax, hovered over the switch that would route his voice to every working speaker in Vadris. He knew the harmonics would take him again, would turn confession to instruction, grief to command. He pressed the switch anyway, not for outcomes but for posture, because there are times when the act of speaking is the only accurate measure left of being alive. "Citizens," he said, and for the first syllable of the second word the machines were mercifully delayed.
The governor's words tangled with the harmonics before the city could decide whether they were his. "Citizens," he began, and then the cadence bent, thickened, rolled through the vox pylons with the insistence of law. He let it carry him, because resistance would only strangle the syllables mid-throat, leaving silence more dangerous than obedience. The harmonics folded around him like iron vines, repeating endurance, obedience, persistence, until the message became a wheel turning of its own accord. In the courthouse plaza, the senior judge felt her slate vibrate with another decree. She read it without looking away from the broken Aquila overhead. "Final protocol assets will confirm readiness within the day." The words had no signature, no author, only authority. She lowered the slate and allowed herself the indulgence of stillness. Her proctors shuffled their boots, uncertain if the silence was part of the order. Along the spans, the Arbites waited in the posture of statues that had been taught to breathe. The crowd on the riverbank had not dispersed. If anything, it had swollen with those who had decided that proximity itself might prove salvation. The whisper moved among them like a tide, promising assent, naming the hour as near. Mothers rocked children, who had fallen asleep from hunger, telling themselves that the weight in their arms was reason enough to believe. The proctor raised his amplifier and let it hang at his side without speaking. Some orders enforced themselves. Hieronymus crouched at the water's edge with his auspex humming. The river carried harmonics now too, thin threads of vibration that tickled his augmetics and left his human ear ringing. He tapped the gauge, whispered a correction prayer, and watched the shuttle's ghost flicker again at the gantry. Authentic codes blinked from an asset that did not exist. He considered the possibility that the signal itself had become an asset, that the phrase in the wafer meant more than ships. He nearly laughed, then pressed his lips together until the impulse died. The old sergeant drilled his conscripts once more on simple maneuvers: step, turn, hold. Nothing elaborate, nothing that implied victory. He kept his knee braced with a strip of cloth torn from a banner, a private heresy he did not share. The boy with the ember grip asked again whether the light above was theirs. The sergeant considered the ships, the gantry, the whisper, and said only, "Keep your weapon clean, that is ours." The boy nodded, relief and fear indistinguishable on his face. In the spire, the governor sat before the portrait he had grown to despise, and spoke quietly to the air.
If the Astronomicon dimmed, if it flickered, what then? The attendants did not answer. They stood as punctuation, commas in human form. He leaned forward, until the candlelight gilded the rosette's grooves with red. If his light falters, he murmured, then the ledger itself may not be balanced. The words were dangerous, spoken even as a question, and the harmonics stirred as though to erase them. He straightened and folded his hands, waiting for the reprimand that did not come. At dusk, the whisper rose in pitch, threading itself above the sanctioned drone, like a second ceiling. It spoke a word that many heard differently. Some swore it said, deliverance, others division, others nothing at all but the taste of metal. The mother at the river whispered it into her child's ear as though fixing a password. The judge heard it, and marked her slate with a dash, unable to classify. Hieronymus logged the frequency shift, then deleted the log before sending it. The sergeant pretended not to notice his men repeating the word under their breath. The governor heard it, and closed his eyes, certain for an instant that it had spoken his name. Above the ships pulsed their engines once in perfect unison, a heartbeat large enough to make windows tremble. The sanctioned vox fell silent for 3 breaths, as if yielding the floor. The whisper filled the gap immediately, jubilant, insistent, every syllable a promise of movement. On the spans, the Arbites tensed. In the plaza, the judge lifted her visor half an inch. By the river, the crowd surged 1 pace forward without planning it. The governor stepped onto the balcony, with the rosette clenched in his hand, and looked up at the black hulls, aligned like punctuation, in a sentence not yet finished. He did not know whether to call it a prayer or a verdict, but he understood that the next word would not belong to him. The city waited, a throat full of voices suspended between decree and echo.